IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. We're all loving working from home, but let's be honest, there are complications. For example, getting help from IT folks if your PC is down can be challenging because you can't just walk up to them anymore. Well, you'll be happy to hear that I have a solution for you, the Intel vPro platform. The platform comes packed with Intel Active Management technology that lets your IT teams remotely manage your systems and fix the problems without having to go to them. So it means more time getting your work done and less time spent on getting support. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can do more of what you want and less of what you don't. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Over the last couple of episodes, we've been looking at what happened in the Galwan Valley and also what Chinese authorities are telling their own people about what happened. But today we want to take a step back and sort of try and understand the broader picture of the India-China relationship. And to discuss this with me, I have Nitin Pai and Manoj Kevalramani. Welcome.
Hi, Aditya. Good to be on your show again.
Hi, Aditya. Good to be here.
And I want to start with you, Nitin. Over the last few days, you've written this three-part series, really looking at this broader picture of the India-China relationship with a very analytical lens. You know, these are very emotional times. Can you tell us how you went about this and what your broad argument is?
Thanks, Aditya. You know, for a regular commentator, writing a three-part series is a very interesting proposition because it gives you a chance to sort of step back, look at what you've been saying over the years and set it in the context of what's happening right now and sort of reflect and then give some recommendations upon reflection. So what I did for Mint was, of course, three parts, three essays over the last week. The first one I used to really talk about the broad civilizational differences between the way the Chinese look at the world and the way the Indians and the rest of us look at the world, and try and suss out what that meant. Then in the second one, I looked at the last decade and said, look, there's been a lot of upheaval which has happened in the last 10 years. And it looks to me that this is, most of the geopolitical events of the world, and ending with COVID, which is not geopolitical, but nevertheless an international issue, have arisen because of something which the Chinese did or did not do. Right? So that's the decade of upheaval because of Chinese actions or inactions. So in the third and the last of the series, I tried to look at India's response to China's rise. We know that this power is likely to be in the ascendant over the next 10, 15 years, probably, foreseeable future. And we need a fresh look at our response. What are the long-term and the short-term responses we can have to Chinese actions and Chinese approaches towards India? So those were the three essays, and I really enjoyed writing them.
All right. So Nitin, in your very first essay, you talk about how India needs this hard-nosed, realist approach towards dealing with China. And you actually talk about how you use the word containment, which a lot of people in the foreign policy community hesitate to use. What prompted you to strike out and say we need to use containment? And why do you think India is not hard-nosed already?
See, India is not hard-nosed enough. Okay, India is partly hard-nosed and the other parts of our nose are soft. But if you look at this from, let's look at it from an ancient and a more recent prism, right? The ancient prism is this. The Chinese civilizational state has always seen itself as a middle kingdom. Up until the 1800s, when they were really bullied and beaten by the European powers, they saw themselves as a middle kingdom where they recognized no sovereign equal. So the emperor of China had the mandate from heaven, and everybody else was either a tributary if you accepted Chinese dominance and culture, or you were a barbarian if you didn't. Right? So when the Europeans first came into China as traders and ambassadors, some of them were really beaten up and said that, look, you can't be an ambassador of the European king. You have to be a vassal of the Chinese emperor. So if you claim to be an ambassador of a sovereign king, we'll put you in prison. These kind of things happened well into the last 500 years until they were beaten in the 1800s by the European powers, which they see themselves as a century of humiliation. So the enterprise, the political enterprise of the Chinese intellectual community for the past 200 years has been to regain that prominence and that status as of the Middle Kingdom. And it looks to me that if you look at Xi Jinping's policies or even the policies of the last 20, 25 years, there has been an attempt by the Chinese state to acquire the Middle Kingdom mindset. The Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is very similar to what the Chinese empires used to do 800 years ago. Shower the region with largesse, give them a lot of gifts, and hope to actually co-opt them into the Chinese sphere of influence. Edward Luttwak, in the book, not the book which you gave me, Aditya, but the other book, by the Rise of China and the Logic of Strategy, talks about how the Chinese Middle Kingdom had a barbarian handling toolkit, right? And the Belt and Road Initiative seems to be coming from that toolkit. Okay. Now, to what extent are these old civilizational ideas representative of contemporary foreign policy? We can't say that there is a one-to-one correspondence. But even scholars like Yan Shutong and others have said, yes, there is an element of civilizational thinking in the way modern China makes its foreign policy. Okay, so that's China. But you look at India, we don't accept the fact that there can be only one Middle Kingdom, and the Indian Rajamandala, for example, has multiple sovereign states, and the logic of the Rajamandala is that the king, the Indian king, or the Indian aspirational ruler tries to conquer the whole of the Rajamandala, which is limited to the Jambudvipa or the Indian subcontinent. It does not envisage an extraterritorial conquest. Right? But within the territory and across the territory, we recognize that there are multiple sovereigns. Now you have two very disparate systems, a Middle Kingdom mindset and a plural multi-sovereign system clashing together. And these systems, because they are so disparate, you would have expected them to clash more often over history. But that didn't happen. There is only one previous recorded incident of 648 AD when there was an alliance between a Chinese Mandarin, Nepalese troops and Tibetan troops, which came and punished one of Harsha's successor. I've written about this in a Business Standard column. It's very interesting. But apart from that one incident, we didn't have any clashes or significant recorded clashes. Now that's because the Himalayas were high, right? But the moment the Himalayas became traversable for armies, roughly in the last 150 years, the number of clashes began to increase, right? So it's not a surprise that 1962 happened, because that was the point when, the Himalayas were basically surmountable by large armies. And that's what happened. Luckily for us, nuclearization happened after that. And the new Himalayas, I contend, are nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons keep the peace. They act as a strategic barrier between the two civilizational states when the Himalayas are already traversable. Now, that's the ancient readout. Okay, so there are disparate civilizational ideas on what international relations ought to be, and the clash between the two creates underlying tension. Now, that's ancient history and ancient thinking. But if you look at modern thinking, every time, right from the 50s onwards, you have seen the Chinese state trying to string the Indian leaders along. Probably because they figured out how Indian political leaders work. They got the measure of every prime minister and played these guys, right? So Chou En-lai used Nehru to socialize the communist Chinese state among the third world, but at the same time were planning an annexation of the Aksai Plains behind his back, right? So Rajiv Gandhi was promised a certain amount of forbearance of their bilateral disputes, but they were still supporting Pakistan and helping Pakistan's nuclear test in the 90s, even after the deal with Rajiv Gandhi. They told Vajpayee that, hey, look, we will recognize Tibet and we will probably recognize Jammu and Kashmir, but they didn't do that. And with Modi, we know what happened with the Wuhan spirit, right? So there has been a consistent element of Chinese reading of India, which seems to suggest that the Chinese think that, the Indian leaders think that the long-term strategy is economic development. So they don't want a war or a conflict right now. That's what the Indian leaders want. So what do the Chinese do? They try and make sure that you have to fight at a time of their choosing. There have been regular pokes. There have been regular, in the last 15 years, there have been regular pokes at the border with India to keep India unsettled. See, in other words, it's not India just trying to contain China, but the argument is that the Chinese are trying to contain India. So that's what we've got to realize. We are in a part of China's containment strategy such that India is seen as this small possible tributary on its frontiers and not a contender for leadership or regional hegemony. So that's the long story of my first piece.
Well, this is interesting, right? I mean, there is a civilizational logic to both these states. If you look at the argument of the Middle Kingdom, right? I mean, this is such an ancient concept. It goes back over 2,000 years to the Zhou dynasty, which was about the Zhou kingdom being in the middle of many other smaller sort of Han Chinese states. And the idea was about literally being at the center. How that gradually got sort of fixed with this slightly spiritual notion of things, everything being under the heaven and the emperor and so on and so forth. That's something that happens over the years, and as sort of these ancient Chinese dynasties, as their sort of might grows, they look outward and they look at they sort of develop this tributary system, which is largely contained to, say, East Asia and to certain parts of Central Asia. And that begins, and that's a lot to do with what Nitin said, just geographical boundaries. And therefore, India doesn't necessarily sort of fall into that domain. Yet the relationship with ancient India or the Indian kingdoms in the subcontinent was about there was sort of transmission of culture, religion, knowledge, all of that. And that's something that even today sort of has a certain resonance within China with regard to India. And therefore, there's a recognition. So every time you see even Modi and Xi Jinping meet, both sides underscore the civilizational state aspect of it. And I think that's one concept that I think the Chinese, it's important to enforce that with the Chinese, because it's a language that they will understand much more than the language of necessarily just states, because that sort of underscores your aspirations, because their aspirations also emerge from a certain civilizational history. The other point that Nitin had made when he was speaking about the need for realism, I wanted to sort of look at it from a Chinese perspective. How do the Chinese actually view India? Largely, South Asia is low on their priority. It has traditionally been low on their priority, what is described as South Asia, the larger Indian subcontinent. And that's because their priority has been their eastern shores. And their priority has been initially protecting their land boundaries towards the west, which had to do with sort of terrorism and all from sort of instability, because the sort of Han domination lies in a certain part of China, whereas if you look at the sort of extremities, you've got Tibet and you've got Xinjiang and you've got Inner Mongolia. And those are your ethnic minorities regions. And their priorities were there to sort of, when the PRC was formed, was to consolidate that. And subsequently, obviously, your eastern shores because of the threat from the US. As sort of the Cold War ends and that threat, the US threat sort of exists, but sort of is much better managed, you see much greater sort of, investment in also looking at how do you expand your scope in South Asia. And that's when in the 90s is where you see, after sort of the early 50s, when you have initial engagement with India and South Asia, in sort of the 90s, you see much more of visits from Chinese leaders and all in the sort of broader Indian subcontinent, and that the engagement intensifies. Now, if you look at BRI, that completely changes and that becomes far more important then. Yet, South Asia ranks much lower in terms of the regional overlook. That's the first point. I agree with the idea that India is seen as a contender that needs to be contained. It's seen as, and that's been the case ever since. So from the 50s onwards, the view has been that, fundamentally India's rise can be problematic for the PRC. But if you look at what's happened in the last couple of weeks and months, the fear that the Chinese have is about India being a spoiler in their broader narrative. And I think there's a disconnect in their own sense of themselves being the greater power and the threat posed by India. They tend to sort of struggle with the idea of India being a haphazard civilizational entity, yet deeply fractured society, unable to get its act together, to being this aggressive contender that has sort of been pushing us, and that we need to work to actually contain. So there's a sort of schizophrenia and also in how they approach India, which sort of ranges from all these different sort of ways. And therefore, it's important that the Chinese also tend to need to take a realistic view of India in terms of what India's capabilities are. I don't think they generally tend to really get a real good sense of where Indian policy is moving.
As far as the conduct is concerned, it is very sharply denominated by power and nothing else, right? So when you have more power, you do what you can. And when you have less power, you just bide your time, right? And, as a realist, I can understand why you would do that. But when you do that, there are also consequences, right? And you should be ready to face those consequences. And the corollary for us is that when you face a uber realist power on the other side, you cannot try and counter it by appeals to idealism. You can't, appeals to third worldism or developing countryism or appeals to gentlemen's agreements and so on, right? You can't even appeal to, for example, forbearance during a pandemic. So when you're dealing with an opportunist real politic, then you have to play that game.
I agree with you, and that's what I'm trying to say. I think the sense is that in India, we have the sense that we have been far more driven by idealism, which I don't think is necessarily, if you look at it from the Chinese perspective, they will not view it that way. Their view is that India has been driven by a fairly sort of strong sense of realpolitik, has been playing different sides, and India has been playing a role in containing them. That is from their prism, if you look at it from their prism. And yes, there is a sort of political argument there is propaganda in there is all of that. But it also tells you about their insecurities with regard to India.
Yeah, no, I think the fact that they can play political leaders is working to their advantage. For example, even if you see the recent communique, they try to absolve the political leadership of any responsibility in this Galwan kind of an incident and say that it's, your frontline troops are doing some mischievous things. So, it's your army that is the problem, naughty boy there. Why don't you go and punish him, right? So I think they've been able to do that with all political leaders we've had in the past. And I suppose that's an exploitation, a realist exploitation of the other side's ideological or state structure.
All right. So I think we all agree that a lot of this is predicated on how much power China had at various times. But also, both of you also talked about China's strategic culture and how it views itself. And Manoj, you pointed out how China's own perception of itself makes it difficult for China to take India seriously, basically. Nitin, you actually go on in your second piece to talk about how what you call China's premature power games. Basically how acts of commission and omission of China have actually been drivers of many major events in the last one decade. Firstly, why do you believe that China has been the prime driver? And what does it really say to us about China?
That's the mystery. Because I was among the first to point this out, that China has been prematurely aggressive. Maybe it's because they started with us in 2006, and then the same kind of conduct traversed into the South China Sea in East Asia, and then over time with respect to the United States and the others, and Australia and others now, finally culminating in what is wonderfully called wolf diplomacy. So it's a mystery because the sense of arrival, what informs China's sense of arrival? Why do they think that they are close to being number one or, close to the apex of what they can achieve? And therefore, or maybe what makes them think that they've already arrived at the world stage, which makes them able to flex their muscles in this way? It's not recent. I was on the TV show yesterday and I pointed out that, China's history of picking a fight with every one of its big neighbors is at least 10 years old. So for the last 10 years, they've been poking their biggest and potential strategic adversaries, routinely. Now, if you're a great strategist, why would you do this? Especially when you know that your biggest adversary, which you've already stated, is the United States of America, which is number one. And you're challenging United States for a global or regional supremacy. And then you go and make enemies out of Japan, out of India, out of Australia, out of ASEAN, out of Korea. Why would you do this, right? So I think there is an element of, there's a puzzle here which I think you need to use political analysis to do this. It's how various political forces within the Chinese leadership play out and what made this particular vein of thinking emerge as a policy direction. The other plausible way of looking at it is possibly, they might have sensed that they don't have that much time. If, demographics catches up and if they realize that maybe, their economic trajectory will not be sustained beyond 10 or 15 years, this is where, this is the maximum you will go before the balance of power changes against you, or, moves in the other direction as far as the second derivative is concerned, then this is the time for you to make that play. Well, if that is so, then it also means that China thinks China has peaked, and that's why they have to flex their muscles. Now, we don't know for sure. You can only guess at why all of this is happening. But the facts on the ground are clear, right? They've picked fights with everybody, from Japan to India to Australia to Europe now. They have, proactively changed the status quo in the South China Sea by grabbing those islands, constructing things on those islands over a period of time, finally assimilating them into their territory and annexing those islands into Chinese administrative systems. And now talking about imposing an air defense identification zone on top of them. They have, fought a case with the Philippines in the court, in the international court. They've not fought. The Philippines fought a case against them in the international court. And the Chinese basically said, we're not going to respect the decisions of the international court. And so forth, right? And of course, now we also have these series of incidents with India. Now, why would you do this? I don't know. But the fact is that you've done it, right? And therefore, you've created this whole upheaval and literally brought the United States back into the, Indo-Pacific because of your action. And your book, Aditya, not your book, it's Luttwak's other book, basically predicts this. In 2012, he wrote that China's actions are going to create a resistance and a concert of powers will join together and resist China, right? And Luttwak is a great guy, but, for a international relations analyst, this would have been a commonsensical thing, which the Chinese somehow, the inscrutable master strategists that they are, seem to have forgotten.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I agree with that completely. Actually, this sort of trend starts from sometime around 2008 onwards, where the Chinese essentially intensify or sort of act on their instincts to become what has come to be now known as much more assertive, for the lack of a better word. And I think there are a number of things, right? If you go sort of to the early 2000s, there is increasing writing within China and among Chinese analysts about expanding outward, looking, to expand your navy, consolidating your defenses in your near abroad. And a lot of this sort of stems, it's very difficult to place one point at it, but say from the time the US started engaging in this war on terror post September 11th, that created opportunities to consolidate things in Xinjiang, but it also created a lot of fear about a new project of democratization that the US was sort of now wanting to put its military force behind. And that then amplified subsequently, that anxiety amplified once the Arab Spring hit. And therefore you had domestically greater control. And once you sort of exercise that authoritarianism domestically in a certain way, policies tend to translate also in terms of how you operate outside. And I think that's how the discourse shifted. There was a purposeful decision, there was insecurity, there was a desire to also expand outward and sort of consolidate your gains. And as sort of the economic slowdown started to hit domestically also, you started, once you started sensing that the demographics are going to be shifting, there's an economic slowdown coming in China, you sought for external markets, BRI sort of starts to come into picture, even much before actually Xi Jinping calls it BRI. The other sort of important aspect in all of this is there was a opportunity that was sensed, which came as the 2008 financial crisis hit. The fact that relative power balance was in their favor following that crisis. I think, there's a famous quote that's reported. I can't remember where it was reported, but there's a famous exchange that has been reported between, at that point in time, when the Obama administration had taken charge in 2008, the US and China used to have this strategic and economic dialogue. And at their strategic and economic dialogue, the Chinese diplomats had basically gone and they were that angry. I think Henry Paulson talks about this, that they were that angry that they ended up going and saying to the Americans that you were the guys who were going to teach us. You were the guys whom we were following. And if this is what you are going to do, then how do we follow you anymore? And this is from an economic point of view. So the idea that China saw a fundamental break in the system, they sensed weakness in the US, and they sensed an opportunity, sort of flows from that. The other thing that Nitin also mentioned, which I agree with, the sense that, the balance of power, that their window of strategic opportunity was limited. That's true, right? I mean, if you go back to 2007, which is when Shinzo Abe first proposes something like the Quad, this idea of the Indo-Pacific, it doesn't materialize in that sense. But at the same time, you see in 2008, the 1-3 agreement between India and the US on the nuclear deal being finalized. There are movements that start to take place, which probably give China the sense, that the Chinese leadership the sense that, look, we have an opportunity right now for many reasons, but that would be a limited window of opportunity. And therefore, this might be a good time to sort of try to do some of the things that we're doing, push the boundaries that we need to push. And internally, as authoritarianism takes hold, the expression externally is also very similar. Your room for flexibility automatically starts to reduce, because you can't be doing one thing at home and another thing abroad, because diplomats change, people change, systems change. And I think that translates into how you operate. It's no surprise that Xi Jinping's China domestically is far more authoritarian than, it's in such a phase that, when people look back at the early 2000s and mid 2000s of, Hu Jintao and who was his premier, Wen Jiabao. Yeah, when people look back at the Hu-Wen period, they start talking about the fact that, that was a classic liberal age of modern China. The fact that this has changed that much is reflected in wolf warrior diplomacy. There's no flexibility. There's desire to assert yourself at every level on everything. And I think that's invariably it's a strategic folly.
Yeah, during that liberal era of China under Hu, you got the sense from the Chinese that they were not going to make the mistakes of the past. They were not going to, if I may use the expression, they were not going to Germany this up. But what they're doing now, primarily, I think, addressing these short time windows, is actually heading in that direction, right? I mean, this sort of Chinese assertiveness is bound to put in place the logic of strategy, as Luttwak put it. Nitin, how would the logic of strategy work for India? Your third piece does address this, right? You say India should act in concert with China's adversaries. How would India pull this off?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think they're making the mistakes which others made. They're making their own new mistakes. It's not trying to push before you've arrived is a big mistake. I mean, it's a new mistake. I don't think any of the previous great powers did it. But anyway, that flippant point apart, the real serious question is, what do we do about this? If you look back at Indian history for the last 70 years, the answer has been very clear. We have a great long-term strategy to take on China. That's called economic growth, right? And Nehru said this. So when the PLA was poking around in the Aksai Plains in the 50s and the late 50s, his response really was, that really doesn't matter to us. It's not an existential threat to the Indian Republic or our system. Let them do what they want. Let's focus on economic development and build an economic base, after which we'll be able to invest in the military power necessary to take them on. I think Nehru's been misunderstood in that sense. He was acutely aware of the economic base at that time and not in favor of militarization for that reason. So, but his mistake, I mean, in hindsight, it proves to be a mistake, was that you really didn't have a choice, because in the long term, you might have the base to build an army, but at the time when they come knocking at your gate, you better have a response. That's been the story ever since. Every prime minister from Nehru to Modi has largely been following the same template to say that, look, let's not worry so much about the border incursions and transgressions, and anyway, it's too complicated and, it's a 100-year-old problem. Let's set it aside. Let's focus on economic development. And to the extent that doing business and normalizing relations with China helps us to get that economic development, it's the better for us. And I think it's a very prudent argument, and I buy that, because I've been saying that our best China strategy is 8% growth, right? So it's not like I discovered this statement. Nehru was doing this in the 1950s. It's not like new. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. In fact, that is and should be a long-term strategy to become rich, acquire economic power, convert that economic power into military power so that we can take them on in a strategic sense. The question is, what about now? Your long-term strategy cannot be an enemy of your short-term strategy. And that was what it was in the Nehru's case, right? Where your long-term strategy of economic development got in the way of thinking clearly about what do we do now. And we shouldn't be making that mistake 70 years hence. I think we made that mistake several times, in the last 70 years, and we should not be making it hence. So what's the real solution? And this is where I quote Kautilya. Now, again, you don't need Kautilya to tell you this, right? I suppose going to a secondary school and talking to a bunch of boys who are fighting each other, you will know exactly what the solution is. If you have to take on a stronger adversary who's much, much stronger than you are, like China's GDP is 5 times India's, and maybe their military power is also, much higher than ours, ball for ball, then what do? Kautilya says you have 2 options. Build an impregnable fort and seek protection of a stronger king. An impregnable fort we already have. I mean, nuclear deterrence gives you that kind of impregnability to the extent that China is not an existential threat, right? Because an existential threat, that would have been a different situation. We have the luxury now of saying that China is not an existential threat. Nothing that the Chinese do at the borders is going to affect the Republic of India. So, as I was saying, so the long-term strategy has been clear, but it has often been the enemy of a short-term strategy. What do we do here in the now? China is not an existential threat anymore because nuclear weapons are the new Himalayas and they keep some kind of a balance between the 2 civilization states. But that does not mean there are no threats or possibilities below the nuclear threshold. And the poking around and the transgressions in the Himalayas are a classic example. So what do we do to contain that? Kautilya says your answer is an alliance. And I think really it's the time for us to act in concert with China's other adversaries, the United States, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, some other Southeast Asian countries whose interests have been trod upon by the Chinese in the last 10 years and are actually looking out for ways to protect their own interests. So an alliance is the answer. And an alliance doesn't mean that you have to sign up to become a member of the NATO and follow the United States wherever it goes on its superpower capers. That's a 20th century story. I think the 21st century story is one where you can align with like-minded countries where interests converge, and such a convergence can actually have a military dimension. And I think people in New Delhi have been scared about the military dimension part of it. But I think it's no harm going and talking about the military dimension. Your ability to give pleasure or deny pleasure and give pain will give you the leverage to work with China. Now, here's the story. If we have a ship which sails into the South China Sea as part of the freedom of navigation operations with the US Navy conducts, the very fact that you are sending a ship there will cause Beijing to rethink. So Professor Mattu asked me this morning that how do you envisage making a deal with Donald Trump's United States? So my answer to him was that you don't really need to conclude a deal. The very fact that we are interested in a deal and we approach the United States to say, hey, why don't we negotiate some kind of an alliance or a strategic partnership which has a military edge? The very fact that you do that will cause Beijing to rethink. So I think we need to be able to develop leverage because that is the only short-term way we'll be able to contain Chinese provocations. Because otherwise we'll be just waiting for this long-term. And, by the time that long-term arrives, if at all it arrives, we would see dramatic changes to the status quo being done by China. Aksai Chin itself is an example, right? In the 1950s, we thought Aksai Chin was de facto our territory and our troops used to patrol the plains. But today, we are ready to accept that Aksai Chin is de facto Chinese territory. And the Chinese are now pushing their limits to the edge of the Shyok River, right? So you lose a few kilometers every year. And in 20 years, you've probably lost the width of what you wanted to claim or what was really yours.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Nitin. I mean, on the long-term strategy, particularly, I think we need to be we need to also be working towards our long-term strategy, which, I mean, for the last couple of years, I think we've sort of lost the way entirely on that in terms of economic reform, focusing on development. Our focus has shifted. Trade deals that we've been talking about internationally, we backed out from RCEP. You can't be wanting to enter into some sort of, you can't be having a presence in a region with negligible sort of stake in the region, right? You need to be involved in some of the trade economic linkages in the region. I mean, there's surveys after surveys of ASEAN leaderships and sort of thinkers and analysts and think tanks from that region tell you that, their expectation from India in theory is very high, but their actual perception of India's investment in the region and stake in the region is very, very low. and compared, and those sort of surveys will show you exactly the opposite with regard to China, where Chinese tech, Chinese political economic influence in the region has continued to grow. So we need to be thinking a little bit more in terms of how we are even working on the long-term strategy. On the short term, I agree. Look, we need to, fundamentally what we need to do in the short term is to take steps that raise the cost of any raise the cost and also demonstrate the raising of cost of any conflict for China. It's fundamentally, and we have to do this without doing what are fundamentally self-destructive things like, canceling projects or automobile investment, or, boycotting goods, or ending up in a position where, hotels are saying we will not accept Chinese nationals or things like that. We need to fundamentally think of how do we do this rather than doing these sort of knee-jerk things.
Yeah, you see, I think in a way, Manoj, the fact that people feel obliged to take this into their own hands and do whatever they think is right is an indication that there is a gap between government policy and, let's say, national interest, right? If government were to articulate an economic strategy much more clearly and say that, look, guys, we know what we're doing. This is how we're going to contain China, or this is how we're going to take on China. I think you will find the people aligning themselves to that kind of an objective. In the absence of a government policy or an articulation of government policy, people start doing all sorts of weird things like burning a map of America and thinking that it's China, or, attacking Chow Mein and this kind of stuff. Because I think overall, more seriously, hurting ourselves by killing the consumer surplus by imposing bans on imports, which are blanket bans, I think are self-defeating.
Yeah, I think we should be sort of, like you said, we should be thinking through, and we should be thinking through also, particularly from a military point of view, given the fact that we will have limitations in terms of our budgets and our threat perceptions. We should be thinking through, like you said, you spoke about the South China Sea. There are other sort of asymmetric options that we can think of when it comes to the Indian Ocean, investments in cyber warfare. There are lots of things that we should be doing, and these are sort of short-term priorities to begin with, and demonstrate our capacity or sort of our ability to impose costs on Beijing in this context, which sort of deters. Will it mean that your incidents at the border and those sort of things will sort of go away? No, not really. But what it tells you is that for people in Beijing, that the cost of this conflict, which is anyway fairly high, will be, the threshold of that cost is really, really low. So if you start to do something immediately, there will be direct implications on you, which will not be necessarily self-defeating for us, such as these boycotts.
Now, game theory says that for a threat to be credible, you should also feel the pain. The threatener also has to have some pain. So, we've got to make credible threats in various ways. But I think the real way to frame this is to say that we have to be able to turn up the leverage until Beijing realizes that the costs are too high for it, right? And it's a question of how much you want to ratchet up the tension. I think at this point in time, the levels are set too low for Beijing to feel anything. They might feel some remorse that, oh my God, we shouldn't have done this. But they might not feel it enough to say that, look, we should make sure that it doesn't happen again. And for that, really, you need to have that kind of a bargain to say that we will make a mess out of the South China Sea for you if you don't, hold back in our neighborhood. So, we will mess with you if you don't stop messing with us. And that message is a question of how much you want to ratchet. It starts from diplomatic engagements with all those adversaries, military exercises, FONOPs, and so on. So it's a graded thing. You don't have to it's not all or one. There are various shades that you could do. You can calibrate it up and down. And I think that is the reason why that option is very, very attractive to me. And that's been one of my arguments for the last 10 years, that the more we are in the South China Sea, the more we are recognized as credible players in the Indo-Pacific, the better it is for us to manage our own relationship with China, which can be to our advantage, economic advantage. We can use China and the economic relationship with China to enrich ourselves. And that's what the Chinese did with the United States. Right? For 20 years, they used US money, US technology, US trade, US investment to become rich and powerful. And that model should be available to us also.
Okay, so you've given us a lot to think about. This episode's actually been a breath of fresh air because you have both spoken very plainly. So clearly, obviously, India needs to take stock of its China policy and it needs to do some serious reassessments and new thinking. To my mind, if there's any good that has come out of this, it is that public opinion has finally caught up with strategic realities. And now that doesn't mean that we should throw one's perfectly good TV set out of the balcony, but it does mean that government needs to take heed and act accordingly. Thank you so much for joining us, Nitin and Manoj.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. Really, really fun week, and I think that you guys should definitely check out some of the stuff we did. So we had Shifa Mehta, who is the host of the show Smile India, on the Paperback Podcast. Really fun thing. On Edges and Sledges, our hosts had an episode just amongst themselves. No guests this time. Really fun show with lots of cool banter. I think you'll enjoy that quite a bit. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet had Shrishti Bell on. Shrishti is the head of Netflix in India, and I think you'll really enjoy that conversation as well. Also, do check out Uncle Please Sit. Joel and Tushar had Anuya Chatakar on. Anuya hosts the popular YouTube channel Books on Toast. And don't forget others of your old favorites like The Habit Coach, Football Should Ball, All Things Policy. All of them are doing a great job during this pandemic, and you should definitely check them out. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey, available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.